So evolution is what? Well, in a biological sense, when we talk about biological evolution, which is what we're going to do now, and by the way, this is sort of a compendium. We're not really on book, though the book is a resource. This is a compendium of material from chapters 13, 14, and 15. So as we go, like we'll do some illustrations out of those chapters. We'll use some pieces of those chapters, but I really kind of more looked at what the state standards require and sort of built stuff from there, because the state standards are a lot more recent than your book's publication date. So not that the information has changed, but the emphasis has changed. So those are your resources. So when we talk about biological evolution, what we're talking about, in the simplest sense, is change over time. That's the very simplest definition for biological evolution, is biological change over time. But that time is going to get sort of an asterisk. Okay? Because that time is a long span of time. A very long span of time, as a matter of fact. And the unifying theme in biology, sort of the unifying principle, is that every living thing on Earth is related. I've already asked this, but I'll do it again. Who here has a cousin? Everybody has a cousin. And you've got second cousins and third cousins and fourth cousins. And humans are all, thousandth cousins, something along those lines. We all share common ancestors. Well, what's even more kind of profound is that biologically all living things on this planet share common ancestors. That's the theory of biological evolution, that little single-celled organisms a very long time ago gave rise to all the living things, all the diversity of life that we see on this planet. Does that sound like a reasonable claim to you, or does that sound just too crazy? You can say it sounds too crazy, because it sounds, I'm looking at this bacteria and I'm looking at a blue whale and I'm like, nah, I don't see it. I don't see it. Do you? When I look at those two things, I don't automatically go, oh, well, they must be related. When I look at that bacteria and a mushroom, I don't look at them and go, oh, well, clearly you can see the family resemblance. When I look at the bacteria and a sequoia tree, there's nothing in that that screams to me, yep, there it is. No. Now, when I look at these little bacteria and I look a single-celled organism like this, I might say, yeah, I could buy that. So a lot of people, when you look at it as this idea that biological evolution says that all life on Earth shares common ancestry, it's not an intuitive thing. It's not something that I think looking at very, very different organisms you would come to automatically. But what if we look at some slightly smaller gaps? These are some different kinds of bacteria. These are very, very simple, very primitive bacteria, probably a lot like the first living things on this planet. And these are slightly more complicated bacteria. When you look at those, would you look at those and say, yeah, I could see how these could be a descendant of that? I think that's a reasonable leap to make. And I can too. I can look at those and go, yeah, okay, they're different kinds of bacteria, but I see how you could have a bunch of mutations, you could add up a bunch of differences, you could get slightly different looking bacteria. Yeah, I'd buy that. Well, we could buy that these complicated bacteria could potentially be related to these other complicated microorganisms. Because I look at these and I'm like, yeah, okay. You could convince me of that. I see structural similarities. I see similarities in how they behave. I see similarities in a lot of things about them. I could see that. Yeah, okay. Does it seem reasonable to you that maybe a unicellular, a complicated single-celled organism like this could be the ancestor of something like this or something like this, which are, this is actually a colonial organism. It's a bunch of single-celled organisms that are living together. It's called volvox, which I remember thinking in high school biology would be a great name for a band. It would, wouldn't it? But I mean, I look at these and I'm like, yeah, okay. An argument could be made. I could see that. What about this? So here we have, these are volvox, and they've got those little green things in them. They're actually photosynthesizing. If I told you that something like this, over a lot of generations, changed and ended up looking like that, does that seem reasonable to you? It doesn't seem crazy, I don't think. I mean, again, it might not be an automatic, like, oh, yeah, I see that. But I look at that and I don't think, no, that couldn't happen. And here's a very simple, very primitive plant. It's a very old type of plant called a liverwort. You can find them down at Beaver Creek on the rocks along the creek. That doesn't seem nuts to me. So, whoops, I missed one. Here's that very primitive, very simple liverwort. And here are some other sort of really simple, really primitive plant-like things. Does that seem crazy? Because here we have a lot of structural similarities. These things all have specialized tissue. They all have chloroplasts to make energy from the sun. Do you know what this is? This is like those up-close shots. What is it? It's moss, actually. That's a very close-up shot of some moss. And these are something called horsetails. Very primitive, but an early vascular plant. And when I look at differences like that, that doesn't seem nuts. Well, then from a really primitive small plant like a moss, does it seem reasonable that you might get larger, slightly more complicated plants? Yeah, okay. That's not quite such a leap, I don't think. And from larger, more complicated plants, I think most people can say, yeah, well, if you can grow a plant this big, maybe over a lot of generations, there could be enough changes that you could have a much larger plant. Yeah, okay. That's not too crazy. And then once you've got plants, and think about how many differences there are between a dandelion and a maple tree. A lot of differences. But they actually have a lot in common. So once you've got a plant, once you've got vascular tissue, which is like their blood vessels, once you've got the ability to make food from sunlight, once you've got the ability to grow long roots into the ground and pull up minerals, well, maybe it's not crazy to think that over a lot of generations you could get something a lot bigger and a lot more different. So, here's a final product, a sequoia tree, and a lot of intermediate stages. So we're not saying that these guys had a baby and it looked like that. That's definitely not what the theory of biological evolution says. But we're saying that over many, many, many generations, you can accumulate enough changes that you can have offspring that look very, very, very different from their ancestors. So, how long does this take? Well, let's just look at that, shall we? The scale of time, you don't have to write all those O's. That would be silly. The scale of time is incredibly long. Incredibly, incredibly long. Long enough, in fact, for this to happen. This is called a phylogenetic tree. It's also called the tree of life. That common ancestor that we're talking about exists somewhere down here. And every branch on this tree, every place that two lineages split off, you're talking about two creatures that were just a little bit different. and that those differences continue to get magnified. So every branch is sort of a step, a cousin relationship away. And there are 3 kingdoms of living things. Biologists classify all living things. We can't just call things Joe and fern and tree. And we want to be really specific about them. So we are Homo sapiens. Everything has a scientific name. The highest level of organization is the domain, and there are 3 domains of life. These are the bacteria, and they still exist. Primitive organisms on this planet looked a lot like them. They're the most like our distant ancestors. These are the archaebacteria. I should circle that in a different color. And the archaebacteria still look a lot like bacteria. They don't look all that much different. Those 2 are pretty similar appearance-wise. And then there's one more group, and that's the eukaryotes, eukarya. You're going to notice in here a lot of these things, flagellates, trichomonads, microsporidia, all those guys. You'd walk right over them, they're single-celled. But in here we also have plants and fungi and animals. So this is all the things that have cells, that have nuclei, that have organelles inside their cells. These guys have no nuclei. So this is actually, some pretty sophisticated stuff here. When we talked about eukaryotes, that's what we're talking about. And I'll actually put the word eukaryote in there. So there, that's the three domains. And I would never expect that you would, know those branches. The big idea here is that there are 3 large ways that we can group living things. We can put all living things on the planet into 3 baskets based on their similarities. And we're in that eukaryote basket. So it takes a long time to go from one common ancestor to this crazy, diverse array of things that we see on the planet. How many of you have ever seen a geological timeline before? Okay. So we're gonna watch a very quick video together, and then we're gonna start constructing a geological timeline. And I think you'll like this. It's kind of fun. You get to get down on the floor, get some colored pencils, get some measuring tapes and calculators, and work together. And I think we'll do 4 in here. So we'll roughly have groups of 5 people working on these things. Okay? Let's watch the video first. One slight change from what you have on your paper is this. You're not taping paper together. As a matter of fact, I've got a kind of wacky, weird solution, but I'll hand you a long strip of paper momentarily. What you do need to do is the Prelab questions, which are on the 2nd page. So I'll give you a few minutes to read the front. Well, I guess, okay, we'll go over the Prelab questions now. Everybody flipped. That's what happens when you say Prelab questions on the next page. So, you're going to read through the lab. This has actually got a lot of math, but then you're going to get to build a timeline. There's a change here, a couple changes. So I'm going to give you a long strip of paper. You will write all of your stuff on the timeline. We don't have a way to print out pictures. You noticed that. So you're going to do your best. You're going to actually sketch. I've got some blank paper. You get to do some sketching and drawing. Drawing. We will cut out the little pictures. We're not grading on artistic merit. We're only looking at, well, label well, okay? If your art is terrible, you should just make sure it's labeled well so we all know what it is. And if you're a fantastic artist, great. Maybe your group designates you as like, hey, draw this. Hey, draw that. You'll probably need more than one person drawing. But, okay. Are you ready? I'm going to have you go ahead and start doing the pre-lab questions. Read the front, start the pre-lab questions. I'm going to float around. Okay, so you'll get started. We'll wrap them up, and you can work on them again tomorrow.